Hey there. Before we start the video, I just wanted to give you a little heads up. The following video contains visual effects and flashing lights that may not be suitable for photosensitive people. If you are photosensitive or prone to seizures, you may not want to watch this video. Alright, with that out of the way, let's get started. I may have mentioned it once or twice before, but one of my absolute favorite genres is survival horror. I got into the genre in high school, my first survival horror actually being Eternal Darkness for the Nintendo GameCube. I wouldn't really get too deep into the genre until after high school, but once I was in, I was in. Nowadays, survival horror seems to be a genre that mostly just indie developers are willing to tackle. We have had some games from AAA publishers like Bethesda's Evil Within series. Resident Evil is starting to make a comeback with the excellent remake of Resident Evil 2. My personal favorite, Silent Hill, is... Okay, well... another one of my favorite series, Siren, is... Okay, moving on. Survival horror definitely had what I consider to be its best days during the 5th and 6th console generations. Sadly, during the 7th gen, when games were switching over to HD graphics, we started to see the genre very slowly, maybe not die off, but become less prevalent than it had been. We definitely saw classic series not quite have the same critical impact they once had. But oddly enough, the 7th console generation actually began with what I consider to be one of the most unique games in the genre. That game was Condemned Criminal Origins. Developed by Monolith Productions, the same team behind the Fear trilogy, or the first 2 games of it anyway, and the more recent Middle-earth games, and co-published by Sega and Warner Bros. Interactive, Condemned Criminal Origins was a launch title for the Xbox 360, releasing on November 22nd, 2005, with a PC version following not too long after. The series was the brainchild of both Nathan Hendrickson and co-founder and former CEO of Monolith Productions, Jace Hall. Remember that last one, it's going to be on the test later. One of the most notable things about the series was that even though the game was set in a first-person perspective, the emphasis was actually focused on melee combat rather than guns. The combat in these games were brutal and intense, so much so that both games are actually banned in Germany. So yeah, these games were considered so violent that they're up there with the first 3 Mortal Kombat games and the Manhunt games as being too violent for release in Germany. But anyway, Condemned Criminal Origins ended up being a critical and commercial success, spawning, at the time of this video anyway, only one sequel, 2008's Condemned 2 Bloodshot. So it has been quite a while since the series saw any sort of official continuation, 11 years at the time of this video, so I think it's time we take another trip to the franchise graveyard. Condemned Criminal Origins revolves around Ethan Thomas, a member of the Serial Crimes Unit, or SCU, a special branch of the FBI tasked with solving crimes involving serial murders. The game opens with what appears to be just another day on the job, Ethan investigating the crime scene of one of the serial killers on his case list. Ethan and his team are led away from the scene, where they are then separated during a power outage. When Ethan restores power to the building, he is electrocuted, which causes him to drop his gun, which is then retrieved by an unknown figure. Chasing this man down, Ethan eventually catches up to him, only for this man to murder his 2 other colleagues with his own gun. Sometime later, Ethan wakes up in his apartment and finds that an old family friend by the name of Malcolm Van Horn has found his way in. Malcolm alerts Ethan that the FBI are accusing him of the murder of the 2 officers, and that the only way to clear his name is to find the real killer. The story takes a few twists and turns, but I'll leave those for you to experience if you somehow haven't played this game already. Because Metro City has essentially become a real shithole, you'll encounter drug addicts and psychopaths, and they will attack you on sight. And because Ethan doesn't have his gun, you'll need a way to defend yourself. You'll need to find makeshift weapons in the environment, from pipes to 2x4s to rebar. Despite being in the first-person perspective, the game has a large emphasis on melee combat. I can't think of too many other games around that time that were first-person brawlers. I know that there was a game called Breakdown that came out a year earlier, but I never played it. Games have come out since, like Dead Island and Zombie U, but that was years after this one. Like I said before, the game has this gritty brutality to it. You can even see people's teeth flying out when you hit them. Hell, the attacks even sound painful. That's not to say that guns are completely absent, though. You can find guns lying around, sometimes hidden, and sometimes enemies have them. Though enemies are much more dangerous when they're armed with a gun. If you take out an enemy before they fire too many shots, you can actually pick up their gun and it'll still have some ammo left. And it's important to do this too, because while you do find guns, you don't find ammo. If you do run out of ammo, you can still use the gun as a melee weapon for a short time, but it will break after a while. You'll also likely find better candidates for melee weapons soon enough anyway. You also can't take ammo out of the same type of gun, so it's best to just leave it in a place you'll remember to go back to after you've cleared out all the enemies. You also get a taser that recharges pretty quickly if you're having a particularly tough time with the enemies. If there are multiple enemies surrounding you, you can actually trick one of them into hitting another, which will then cause the one that got hit to turn around and try fighting the attacker. Essentially, you can trick enemies into fighting each other. If you block too early, you can actually see enemies stop themselves from completing their attacks and wait for you to drop your guard again before trying to attack you again. Hell, enemies that don't spawn in with weapons will try and find them off the environment, or switch them out with better ones while fighting you. It's a really nice attention to detail. Throughout the game, you'll be accompanied by Ethan's laboratory assistant, Rosa, who fully believes Ethan is innocent. And she will analyze any evidence that you find during the game, which is a pretty good time to start talking about the other major gameplay element, the forensics system. Ethan is implied to be somewhat gifted in that he can tell how certain things have played out and where to look for evidence. And luckily for him, he still has his forensics gear with him in his attempt to find the culprit. A black light to find DNA evidence, a sample collector, a digital camera, and a spectrometer, which in this game is used to help you find collectible dead birds. Yeah, I just said that. Admittedly, in the first game, the forensics gameplay is pretty basic. Finding the evidence takes place in closed-off areas, and you'll be alerted when you're leaving the evidence area. The game automatically pulls out the required tools for you, so all you really have to do is line it up. Again, super basic stuff. The game doesn't get super tricky with it until one of the very last areas of the game. If there's one thing that's important to get right in a survival horror game, it's its atmosphere. And Condemned, I'm glad to say, has great atmosphere. Despite the fact that the game looks like an original Xbox game from a year beforehand, the atmosphere, world design, and theming are all fantastic. The character designs may not look that great, even for 2005 standards, but the level design, hell, even the music all make up for it. The music is very minimal, but it definitely adds to the overall atmosphere, much like how it was in my beloved Silent Hill games. I highly recommend playing this game with headphones. One of my absolute favorite areas in the game is the abandoned department store. The atmosphere here is incredible, and seeing the abandoned Christmas decorations everywhere really gives off a sense that this building had life surrounding it before it was lost to crime and drugs. The music in this level is this dreary Christmas music, and it really drives home the fact that this place used to have such life to it. One of the coolest things that happened while getting footage for this video was where a female squatter shouted, "What are you doing here?" and then proceeded to shoot at me. It gave me flashbacks to the splicers in BioShock who have effectively taken up residence in this abandoned department store. I feel like any flaws with the game would just be me nitpicking, and none of them are particularly game-breaking. Like I said before, visually speaking, the game doesn't seem like a major jump in graphics between the OG Xbox and the Xbox 360. But considering that this was a launch title for the Xbox 360 from a third-party developer, they probably weren't aware of how to fully grasp the power of the new hardware, or maybe didn't have the budget for it at the time. That's not to say that the game looks awful, but the character models in particular definitely scream 2005 game. If there was a more prevalent complaint that I have, it's how you sprint in this game. Your normal walking speed is pretty slow, so to sprint, you have to hold down the left stick and keep it pressed in while moving. It's not the most comfortable position in the world for your thumb to be in. Also, your sprint meter drains very quickly and doesn't recharge all that fast either, so you may find yourself slowly walking everywhere. Also, you can't aim down sights in this game when using the guns, which is how I prefer to use guns in video games. But I can't think of too many other games from that time that had ADS for guns. They probably exist, but none immediately flip to mind. The last thing is something I'm not particularly offended by, but this game is pretty short. For this playthrough, I was able to beat it in about 5.5 hours. That might have been more of a problem when the game was $60, but considering how cheap the game is nowadays, I don't think that's anywhere near as big a problem. As a side note, lately I feel like a big part that plays into games getting negative reviews and a lot of crap when they're first released is the fact that they cost $60 when they first come out. But that's a topic for another video. So overall, Condemned Criminal Origins may be a little rough around the edges, and the experience doesn't last very long, but I think what it does well, like its atmosphere and its brutal melee combat, are done exceptionally well. It provides a solid foundation that a potential sequel can improve on. And in the spring of 2008, about 2.5 years after the release of the first game, that's exactly what happened. I don't know about you, but seeing the things that Ethan Thomas saw during the events of the first game would probably drive me crazy. And unfortunately for our hero, that's exactly what ended up happening. Condemned 2: Bloodshot takes place 11 months after the events of the first game. Ethan's grip on reality has slipped so hard that he quits the SCU and becomes a drunken mess. That is until both Ethan and the SCU receive a distress call from none other than Malcolm Van Horn from the first game, who appears to have gotten into a real mess this time. Ethan could care less, but the SCU want Ethan on this case immediately, as he was the last one to see Malcolm alive. Also, let's take a quick second to appreciate just how awful this song is.
Blop, blop, fizz, fizz. What a stinking drunk he is.
After a long trek through a city covered in tar, and yeah, this chapter's an hour long, and it's to show Ethan's hallucinations are getting worse. Okay, I'm gonna bring this up later. I've got stuff to say about this, but yes, it really is this dark and ugly, and hard to see. Well, anyway, after that, Ethan is reunited with Rosa, and an uneasy alliance is formed with 2 other SCU officers. There's LaRue, who is awesome, partially due to the fact that he's voiced by Phil Lamar.
LaRue here, ready to give this shithole a handle.
And Dorland, who is so totally not an obvious villain. Yeah, I know that's probably a spoiler, but I'm sure you could see this coming from a mile away. This leads into a twisted plot that involves serial murders of the city's political officials, a mystery involving a psychopathic murder cult, and even Ethan's own personal demons seemingly made manifest. Released in the spring of 2008 for the Xbox 360, and this time around the PS3. Surprisingly no PC version this time around. The sequel's console exclusive. The first thing you'll notice about this sequel is, oh boy, Ethan looks and sounds vastly different than he did in Condemned 1. He went from being a normal-looking and sounding dude voiced by Greg Grunberg.
So, this serial killer X kills serial killers. He takes them down using their own methods. If the torturer is still at large, what's his MO?
To the guy from Hatred. Okay, maybe not that edgy. It's such a jarring contrast between the two games. I can maybe kind of deal with his new look, but I seriously doubt 11 months of hard drinking and horrifying hallucinations would change your voice up that much.
That's me, Ethan Thomas. Drunk, tired, and pissed off. Why? Because this damn city's too fucking blind to see what's killing them.
He must have been spending the last 11 months drinking rum and concrete. I get that they're trying to get his new voice to fit with the new, darker tone of the game, but I think in this case, I think they went a little overboard.
I'm not going anywhere near that place. I might do something I'll regret.
In fact, funny story, I distinctly remember when I went to go buy a copy of the first game at GameStop. Yeah, I know, GameStop is evil. It was when the second game was still about 7 months away, and I mentioned it to the cashier, and he went, "Yeah, I saw it, it looks weird." I mean, he wasn't wrong. This game is pretty fucking out there, and not just because of the hallucinations. For example, one of the levels is a doll factory, where some of the enemies are walking, talking dolls that explode. The whole game can feel like a fever dream, or fever nightmare, I guess, because of just how weird and borderline nonsensical it can get at times. In fact, the entire game is much grittier than the first, if that's even possible. There's actual gore this time around, guns can actually blow people's heads off, and now there's a mechanic where you can actually kill enemies using the environment itself. Which I guess is a good segue to talk about the game's combat. Condemned 2 vastly expands on the combat from the first game, both melee and the gunplay, which I'll go more into detail with later. For starters, you can actually fight with your bare hands this time, something you couldn't even do in the first game. Granted, in the first game, you're never too far away from a weapon at any given time, so it never really became that much of an issue, but Condemned 2 completely removes whatever stress you may have experienced from being unarmed. These makeshift weapons, I find, are far more plentiful and in a greater variety this time around. You'll find pipes, rebar, and 2x4s like in the first game, but also stuff like crutches, medical braces, bricks, gumball machines, even friggin' toilet seats, which the back of the box proudly uses as a selling point. Weapons can even be thrown now, which can be handy if you feel like temporarily stunning a foe, or for destroying semi-plot crucial sonic emitters. But with no reticle to aim with, it can be kinda tricky, so I don't fully recommend it. This time around, weapons can actually break after extended use, but you're still more than capable of taking out enemies barehanded. In fact, there's also a combo system in place. Parry an enemy's attacks by blocking at just the right moment, and follow up with a 1-2 punch will gain you, I don't want to say experience points, but there is kind of a scoring system tied to how well you do, both in the combat and the game's forensics system. Again, I'll get more into detail with that when we get there. You have control over your left and right arms separately by using the left and right triggers, or L2 and R2 in my case since I played the PS3 version. You can't dual-wield weapons in both hands, but you can punch with both arms separately. Holding the two triggers together allows you to block. And once again, you can trick enemies into fighting each other. There's even a dedicated sprint button this time around. No more uncomfortably holding down the left stick. Holding down the right trigger, or the R2 button, will automatically make you sprint in the direction you're facing. I even feel like the sprinting itself is faster than it was in the first game. You will still slow down if you run out of breath, but I find it recharges much faster this time. A major improvement over the first game. Also this time around, you have regenerating health. As long as the compartment doesn't drain all the way, your health will refill after a few seconds. During combat, you'll auto-lock onto the closest enemy. This can be handy because now you can sidestep and still be facing your enemy and still be in control of your actions. As for the guns, not only do you get to play with them more frequently, but there's also a wider variety this time around, just like with the melee weapons. Hell, you can even reload them this time, and also take ammo from the same kind of gun and load it into yours. There's also supply lockers with ammo in them. And one addition I'm glad to have in the sequel is the ability to aim down sights, which was completely absent in the original. Though you may notice your aim is awfully shaky if you try doing this. And that leads us into another gameplay mechanic, alcohol usage. Because Ethan is now a raging alcoholic, precision aiming with a gun while sober is quite the challenge for him now. Your aim is shaky, and because of it, you're going to end up missing a lot of your shots. Which is why whenever you have access to a firearm, you may see full bottles of liquor scattered about. Downing an entire bottle of it will straighten your aim and allow you to shoot more accurately while ADSing. It's a pretty clever way of making Ethan's alcohol dependency into a gameplay element. One new feature Condemned 2 adds is environmental kills. If you beat an enemy down enough, there's a chance you can finish them off with something in the environment. You can slam their head against doors, throw them into a TV, or even crush their heads with a vice. Condemned 1 had optional finisher moves you could pull off too, but this game really takes that idea and runs with it. Alright, now let's talk about Condemned 2's version of the forensic system. Like the combat, the forensic system is vastly improved upon. In addition to sending evidence to Rosa, you'll be given multiple choices on what kind of evidence and events occurred, and you'll receive a score based on how accurate your choices are. You really have to use your head this time to figure these out if you want the best possible scores. This, and how well you do in combat, will land you experience points, I don't know what else to call it, at the end of every chapter, and doing exceptionally well at these will give you permanent upgrades, like improved melee damage or a bulletproof vest for improved defense against guns. So it's absolutely worth it to do your best during these levels. Destroying sonic emitters, giving responses to characters, completing secondary objectives like destroying meth labs, and finding TVs which give you live events on the secondary plot will all add towards your ranks and upgrades. So in short, Condemned 2's gameplay I find to be a big improvement over the original in a lot of ways. The combat is definitely more satisfying, and the forensic system is far more rewarding, even fun at times. I usually use the third quarter or so of these videos to talk about what I didn't like about a game, and in Condemned 2's case, I have very few complaints with the game itself, but some of them I've found to be pretty major. I'm going to go ahead and talk about my biggest complaint with the game, and this is going to be the part of the video where I'll need to warn those of you watching who are photosensitive or get dizzy or something looking at flashing imagery, but I am going to be showing some of these on screen for the next few minutes. So if you want to know my thoughts on it, I'd suggest looking away from the video or shutting your eyes while I talk about it. I'll let you know when it's safe. Okay, we good? Alright, here's the deal. Some of the visual effects in Condemned 2, which are meant to represent Ethan's hallucinations, are entirely too intense. The first game kinda had these too during Ethan's premonitions, but they cranked it up all the way to 11 here, and it's borderline unbearable at times. One whole chapter of the game throws these on screen, and they continue up until the very end of the chapter, wherein which you're actually trying to shoot at enemies that can kill you in like 5 hits. Ignoring the fact that these screen effects and filters are way too strong in the game, the fact that you're actually meant to engage in combat with enemies while this is happening, I want to know who at Monolith thought this was a good idea. Did they think this wouldn't give people seizures? A fun fact about myself, I've actually had epileptic blackouts before, and the first time I played Condemned 2 was in 2016, 4 years after I had 2 epileptic blackouts in 1 year. I thought I was going to have my 3rd blackout right then and there playing this one chapter of the game. This even happens during a cutscene where Ethan's just talking to someone. Oh, and God help you if you're playing this on a big TV, too. Okay, that part of the video's over. It's safe to look at your screen now. This is tangentially related, but the default brightness setting in the game is way too McFreaking dark. I cranked the brightness up in the settings, but there are some areas, especially the hallucination scene in the game's opening act, that is still super dark and incredibly difficult to see. Speaking of adjusting things in the settings, the default turning sensitivity is way too high. You spin around so fast that I had to turn it down too so I wouldn't get dizzy. I've already shown how the game's visuals can make your head spin, there's no need for the controls to do it too. And this could just be me, but I found walking in a straight line to be kind of difficult at times. I don't think my controller's busted, but I did feel like I was leaning a little to the left when trying to walk straight. And I have no idea if this is just me or the game. The PS3 version, which is the version you're seeing now, can't go up to 1080p, while the Xbox 360 version, which I don't have, apparently can. I did notice a lot of jagged edges, meaning the anti-aliasing isn't great, and I did notice that the frame rate would have a tendency to drop to about 20 to 25 frames per second. I know that the PS3 was notoriously difficult for third-party developers to work with back in the day due to its bizarre architecture, so I'm thinking this bizarre performance is due to that. Condemned 1 had good anti-aliasing and frame rate for the most part, and that was a 360 game from 2005, so I'm wondering if the PS3's tricky architecture had something to do with the noticeable downgrade. Before we end the segment on Condemned 2, I want to quickly mention that the game actually had online multiplayer. In addition to the standard versus and team versus modes, the game also had several types of horde modes and a variation of capture the flag. I've never played them myself, hence why I don't have any footage of it. And also the fact that the servers were hosted by GameSpy, which went tits up in 2013, effectively killed the online multiplayer modes. Overall, Condemned 2 might be rough around the edges, but at the same time, I can still recommend it for the things it does right. I would still recommend you play them in order, just so you're not lost on some parts of the story, though. Maybe play the Xbox 360 version of Condemned 2, though, if possible. Neither game is particularly expensive, so it shouldn't be too hard to track down copies. Normally in these franchise graveyard videos, this is where I start talking about how the game or games in question sold poorly or how the rocky development ended up killing the developer and therefore any chance of a continuation of any kind. But the truth is, like I mentioned at the start of the video, Monolith Productions is still around. In fact, 1 year after Condemned 2, they released Fear 2, and they would eventually go on to create the Middle-earth games, which would also be published by Warner Bros. Interactive. Condemned 2 ended up being something of a commercial success, selling well over 1 million copies across both platforms, and garnering pretty positive reviews as well. But apparently, that wasn't enough for Sega and Warner Bros. To consider funding a third entry. In 2012, an alleged former developer held an interview on the NeoGAF forums stating that the game didn't sell well enough to earn a third title. Sadly, it will never happen. Condemned 2 just didn't sell enough copies. It is sad that Condemned 2 got caught up in the everything needs multiplayer. We could have really used that staff on multiplayer to make the single-player campaign amazing. There were some good ideas of where to take the game. I've always wanted to do a reboot and just play Condemned 2 off as a bad hangover and have Thomas closer to what he was in C1. That statement seems pretty final, and for a while, that was all she wrote on the entirety of the Condemned series. That is, until a cold February day in 2015, when Monolith co-founder and former CEO Jace Hall posted on Facebook announcing that he now owned complete and total rights to the Condemned IP. Part of his statement reads, "I helped to create a video game console franchise called Condemned. I currently own the entire franchise. There have been 2 game titles released for the franchise, Condemned Criminal Origins and Condemned Bloodshot. They both did well, and I am consistently asked when a third game might be created. Since I am focused on other things, and will be for quite some time, this franchise is just sitting there. I am contemplating finding an interested and proven indie development team and providing it to them, so that they can take over the franchise and move it forward. Should I explore this idea further?" IGN reached out to him and he further elaborated, Once I choose a studio, everything will be up to them. They are in control. They can go to Kickstarter, privately raise money, shop it to publishers, etc., whatever they feel is the best approach for them. And I am not going to put rules or constraints on them. I want them to be free to do the best job they can. Well, considering that Monolith is now a studio owned by Warner Bros. Interactive and are clearly not interested in pursuing a sequel to a long-dormant franchise, and Sega is now perfectly content with just being the Sonic and Yakuza company until the end of time, this is great news for fans of the series, such as myself, who are interested in seeing a third Condemned game actually happen. I myself even replied to this post saying that I would love to see it get made. Though, there's one thing that may throw a wrench into all of this excitement, and that's in my research for these quotes from Jace Hall, it would seem as though the 2 Facebook posts he made have since been seemingly quietly deleted. It could just mean that Mr. Hall was sick of being badgered about it and just decided to delete those posts when he doesn't have anything to announce, or, worst case scenario, stuff fell through and the game is now no longer possible. At the time of this video, nothing has been seen, announced, or even mentioned about a new Condemned game since those 2 now deleted Facebook posts. So for now, it looks like the possibility of a proposed Condemned 3 is totally up in the air. But if the fact remains that Jace Hall still owns the IP, and that a third game could still eventually happen, then we may actually have to wait and see before we lay this series to rest in the franchise graveyard. Hey guys, if you made it to the end of the video, I want to thank you for watching, and hopefully it didn't give you a seizure. I wanted to take a moment to announce that I've opened a Ko-fi page, so if you really enjoy my stuff and feel like throwing a couple of bucks my way, you can now do that. You're under no obligation to do this, but if you do, you will get a verbal shout out at the beginning of my next major video after each donation. You can check it out over on ko-fi.com/madmorpheusgaming. And of course, I have a Twitch, I have a Twitter, and I have a Let's Play channel. Links below for all the good stuff. Again, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.